Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Boswell Book Company and Schlitz Audubon Nature Center virtual event series. We are so honored to be part of this program. Before we get started, I am Daniel from Boswell, and I'm actually joining you from the floor of the bookstore, which I don't think I've ever done since COVID for a virtual event, but that's the way it is today. I just want to mention that it is day 5039 of Boswell being in business. We have a number of programs, both virtual and in-store and at other venues around town. And so visit boswellbooks.com for more information on that. I want to let you know that this event is a Zoom webinar. So we can't see or hear you, but you can see or hear us. You can put questions in the Q&A. Please put questions in the Q&A. You can also comment in the chat. Please say hi. And I heard from one of you that my audio is a little garbled, which is probably because I'm on the floor, but at least we have a PowerPoint, so that's something. I'm going to pass things from Harrison Franz of Schlitz Audubon Nature Center to introduce.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, as Daniel said, my name is Harrison Franz. I am a naturalist here at Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. I've been working there since August 1st, and I'm kind of new to birding, so I'm joining this panel just because I'm very interested in learning more, just like all of you. And so I will introduce you to Dr. Tim Birkhead. So he is an ornithologist. He is a professor of behavior and evolution at the University of Sheffield, where he researched breeding and survival of the common murre. His recent research includes the adaptive significance of egg-shaped birds, and he has won 4 teaching awards, including the National Teaching Fellowship in 2017 by the Higher Education Academy. And his recent books include The Most Perfect Thing, The Inside and Outside of a Bird's Egg, which won the Zoological Society of London's 2017 prize for communicating zoology, and The Wonderful Mr. Willoughby, the First True Ornithologist in 2018. And then, of course, he is introducing his newest book to us, Birds and Us, a 12,000-year history from cave art to conservation. So I will give it to Dr. Birkhead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, you'll probably all have to bear with us a little bit because we've got a few technical problems, and I'm going to be dependent on people on your side of the ocean to click my PowerPoint presentation forward when I ask. So if we could go straight to the PowerPoint. Thank you very much. Okay, and we'll go straight to the next slide. Okay, so I first became interested in our relationship between birds and people several years ago, about 12 years ago, when there was a big starling roost, a murmuration every night, about 12 miles from where I live in Yorkshire, in the Peak District. And one of the things that amazed me about this starling roost was not just the fantastic display of birds above our heads, but the fact that pretty well every evening there were about 300 people that came to watch on this very cold hillside. When I looked at those people, I realized that I was the only person with binoculars. Most of these people weren't what you would call birders. And that started me thinking about the way people relate to birds. Okay, next slide. And we relate to birds in all sorts of different ways. So people feed feral pigeons in the park. That's the top left, and then to the right, people race pigeons. They train them up and feed them up as though they're Olympic athletes. And the bottom left, people breed cage birds like canaries and then compete amongst themselves for who has the best shaped bird or the best singing canary. And then, of course, bottom right, there are people that hunt birds as well. Next slide. And birds have featured a lot in art through the centuries. Of these wonderful white-faced gerfalcons on the left, and then in the middle is Francis Bacon's very bizarre diving pelican. And then on the right, there's a surrealist painting, again showing, in this case, a common myrrh and a common myrrh egg. Next slide. And we engage with birds in all these different ways. And even during the terrible bird flu epidemic, people still ignored those signs, do not feed the birds, because the kind of passion that people feel for engaging with birds is so strong. I took this picture in a London park a few months ago. Next slide. And we look after birds in all sorts of different ways. We make nest box for them to breed in. These ones on the top left are designed for sparrows. It seems very bizarre. I took this photograph in Spain. It's a very bizarre design where the entrance hole to the nest box is at the bottom rather than the top, but the sparrows didn't seem to mind too much. We spend a fortune on food for birds. These are Eurasian blue tits on the top right here. People spend a fortune, bottom left, going on holiday to look at birds. And then, as many of you will know, people spend a fortune on very expensive photographic equipment in order to photograph birds. Next slide. And about 20 years ago, my friend Mark Cocker wrote this book, Birders, Tales of a Tribe. And in that, he came up with a classification of the different kinds of people that engage with birds. So next slide. And you'll have to double click this, please. And at one end of the kind of hierarchy was the scientist, and this image, I think, captures the way he thought about me. He wasn't a scientist, but I am. Next slide. And then there's an ornithologist, and Mark said, well, these two scientists and ornithologists are rather similar. Then you can click 3 slides in a row here. And then he distinguished between 3 categories of what you and I would probably call birders. There was, first of all, was the bird hyphen watcher, which he related to something in Britain that's called a train hyphen spotter, and that's kind of almost the lowest form of life. And then there's a bird watcher without a hyphen, which is fairly respectable, but then really respectable is somebody that calls himself a birder. Next slide. And then the most despised kind of person that engages with birds is the twitcher. This is the person that at the drop of a hat will stop what he's doing and fly to wherever it is that a rare bird has been seen, go and see it and tick it off and come back. You know, no real interest in the birds, just a bizarre form of collecting. Next. Then there's a category that Mark called the dude. Now, I don't know whether this is true in North America, but in Britain, if you go to a bird reserve and sit in a hide, you're bound to meet a dude before very long. You're sitting in the hide, minding your own business, and suddenly the person next to you, and it's always a man, will say, I'll tell you what you're going to see here. And this is Mr. Know-all. This is the person that pretends to know everything about birds, but actually doesn't know a great deal. And then the lowest form of birder life that Mark categorized was the robin stroker. Next slide. And usually this was portrayed as a little old lady who fed the birds, including the European robin pictured there in her front garden. Since Mark wrote that, things have changed quite dramatically. If you go to the next slide, please. So we now know that scientists might as well be, can equally well be women as it can be men. Next, we also know that ornithologists come from all sorts of ethnic backgrounds. The next, you can click 3 times, please. Bird watchers, birders, and bird watchers can be male or female equally frequently these days. Next. Twitchers can also be female as well. Next. Dudes, as I say, are always men. And finally, I'm a robin stroker as well, because next slide, during COVID, during lockdown, I tamed the robins in my garden using mealworms. And so the point I'm trying to make is that there are no easy ways to categorize the different ways that people engage with birds. And during the COVID experience, you know, we actually had 3 or 4 tame robins in the garden, and it does bring a great deal of pleasure. Next. And over the years, as a scientist, I've been fortunate to study a wide range of bird species, including all of these. And if this was a live talk and you were there in person, I would be offering a prize for anybody that could identify all of these birds, but we can't really do that over Zoom. Next. So we care about birds because we're birders in different ways. Next slide. And the thing that really struck me when I started to think about this was that our relationship has changed dramatically through time. Next. And sadly, for most of our history, it's been a relationship of exploitation. Next. So the prime reason for exploiting birds, next, is for food, and local people collected seabirds. And across Europe still, and this is pretty horrible, people still kill huge numbers of warblers to sell in fancy restaurants. It's not through necessity, but this is just a way of making money. Next. We've also harvested birds, next, through for their feathers. So on the left there, that's a bundle of eiderdown. The reason why your down jacket costs a fortune is that after the down has been collected in a very non-invasive way from the nests of the eider ducks, some poor unfortunate person has to pick out all those shreds of grass from it before it can be used as a part of clothing. In the middle there, people, of course, native people have been using bird feathers to adorn themselves in the same way that the birds are adorned to enhance their status. And then finally, we've used feathers as writing implements since the earliest days of South American civilizations. We tend to think of the quill as a European invention, but it was being used by indigenous people in South America long before that. Next. Of course, we've also, next, exploited birds for their feces. And there's been a huge guano industry that's operated mainly on the islands off South America for 200 or 300 years. And people in Britain, some people in Britain made an absolute fortune out of this. The birds themselves weren't harmed, but it was a pretty brutal regime for the poor, unfortunate people that had to work on those islands. Next. Let's just have a quick look at the use of birds as food, because that's been the main reason people have related to birds. Next. And the beginning of my book starts in this cave. Next. Its name is El Taco de la Figueres, and it was discovered by this chap on the right, Willoughby Werner, in the early 1900s. And the thing about this cave, as we can see in the next slide, is that it has fantastic images of birds. In fact, in this cave, there are more bird images than all other caves put together. Now, this is a kind of computer-enhanced image because over the years, the original images have become rather faded. And these are probably great bustards, which is about the size of a turkey and a formidable meal. And that cave was at the intersection between, it was very near the Straits of Gibraltar, where huge numbers of migrant birds appeared in the spring and autumn each year. And the people obviously congregated here in order to harvest them. And these images date back to about 8,000 years ago, so very ancient. Next, we can move from there to the Faroe Islands that lie between the tip of Scotland and Iceland. And this is a remarkable archipelago where people have been dependent on birds for food for centuries. Next. And these are some classical pictures of Faroese fowlers, as they were called, catching puffins. And the entire society there, as I say, was dependent on puffins, moors, I call them guillemots because that's what we call them, gannets, fulmars, and also pilot whales, much more controversially. Next. I visited the Faroe Islands several years ago and stayed with this lady on the left. And she cooked as a conventional, well, I was going to say an English breakfast, but it was a pretty English stroke Faroese breakfast. And after we'd finished, she brought out this little bowl of eggs. And these are fulmar eggs from the recent fulmar egg harvest. So the people on the Faroes still harvest birds' eggs. It's an important part of their tradition. And a little bit later on, she got out her photograph albums. And this picture on the top right is her in the brown jumper in front of a huge collection of common murre eggs. And common murre eggs were the ones that people collected most abundantly. And they were collected mainly from this cliff on the bottom left here, which was once a huge seabird colony. And as you can see, she was very fond of birds and has all these stuffed puffins, including, and the guillemot or murre, including this partially albino one. But since her childhood, sadly, the seabird populations on the Faroes have absolutely crashed. And whilst I was staying with her, she moved from the kitchen there where she was holding the eggs to the window by these stuffed birds and looked out and said, you know, at one point I could look over the sea here and see thousands and thousands of murres and puffins, and now there are hardly any. And it's almost certain that this crash in numbers of puffins and murres is due to climate change. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Next. This painting, which is in the National Gallery in Tórshavn, which is the capital of the Faroes, kind of gives us a sense of the way the local people engage with birds. And I kind of love the naivety of this painting, but you can identify what all these species are. You know, from the top left, there's a puffin, an oyster catcher. I'm not quite sure what the next one is, but then there's a razorbill, common murre, kittiwake. Then starting again on the next row, we have a black guillemot, and then a great skewer, greater black-backed gull, and so on. The one at the bottom right is interesting. This is a pied raven, and the Faroes were famous for their pied ravens. And for a long time, people thought the black and white ravens, of course, ravens are normally black. They thought the pied raven was a separate species, but in fact, it's just a kind of genetic mutation. But there was a high frequency on the Faroes. Sadly, though, when museums started to become popular in the early 1800s, every museum wanted a specimen of the pied raven. And so hundreds were collected, and now there are no pied ravens left. Next. Science has also been responsible for the destruction of a lot of birds, because during the 1800s in particular, ornithologists wanted specimens. Of course, there were no binoculars, there were no field guides, and the only way you could really identify a bird was to have it in the hand. And people made study skins and started to make collections. I particularly like this painting, which is by Edward Millais, pre-Raphaelite artist, and the man in bed holding the bird, surrounded by his grandchildren, is John Gould, who was known as the Birdman. He was also responsible for collecting probably more hummingbirds than anybody else in the world. And he was visited by Millais and his son. And by this time, Gould was not highly regarded in ornithological circles. And Millais said to his son when he left the house, because if this is the scene that he had seen, this would make a wonderful painting. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about Gould. There he is in old age. And the lady next to him is Jemima Blackburn, as it says. And she was one of the most proficient bird artists of her generation. Next slide. You can see there a beautiful drawing of a European cuckoo. Now, of course, throughout most of the history of ornithology and most of the history of our relationship with birds, women were very scarce. They sometimes supported their partners, but they've had very little voice. But Jemima Black, and so what I've done in the book is wherever I've found an appropriate example, I've tried to emphasize the role that certain women played in the history of ornithology and our relationship with birds. And Jemima Blackburn was this superb artist that during her lifetime certainly was never fully recognized, but she was also a feisty woman. On one occasion, as the top right picture shows, she came across a meadow pipit's nest with a young cuckoo, and the young cuckoo was in the process of ejecting the young meadow pipits, and she sketched it. And she wrote a short note to the scientific journal Nature to describe what she'd seen. John Gould, when he was preparing his Birds of Europe, wanted a picture of this topic. And so he produced his own. Next slide, please. But you can see that what Gould has done is to elaborate what Jemima Blackburn saw, and particularly adding the parent bird. Now, at that time, Gould was vehemently anti-Darwinian and didn't like the natural selection explanation for brood parasitism, which is what cuckoos do. And he thought that brood parasitism, this behavior of ejecting the host's chicks, had evolved with the approval of the parent bird. And that's why he added the parent meadow pipit there in the background. Jemima Blackburn was incensed by this, and so she wrote another letter to the journal Nature to point out that Gould had misconstrued and misinterpreted her observations, and that she wasn't responsible for this misinformation. So, she's a heroine of mine. She stood up for herself. She was a great artist. She was a competent observer, but she's one of very few women in the story of our relationship with birds. Next. Following on from Gould, collecting birds for scientific purposes just became an obsession. Hundreds and hundreds of, it was mainly men, collected birds. Most of those collections, luckily, are now in national collections like the one on the picture on the right, and they still form an incredibly useful role. Some people are upset by the sight of all these bird skins, but I think it's important to try and put that into perspective. The total number of bird skins in museums across the world is thought to be about 100 million. Okay, I can hear you gasp that this is a horrendous number, but that's also the number of birds that are killed by domestic and feral cats every day. I think that that does put it into perspective. But you had to be fairly heartless to be shooting birds on the level that Alan Octavian Hume was doing to perform these collections. But right at the end of the 1900s, we're starting to see a change. Next slide. And we start, oh, sorry, just before I say that, then shooting birds for fun has continued unabated. And I find this morally indefensible. Next. At the beginning of the late 1800s, early 1900s, we start to see people showing some empathy for birds. Next. And of course, that is strongly linked to our desire to conserve and protect birds. Next. And the beginnings of that bird protection movement occurred here. This is on the east coast of England, on something called the Flamborough Peninsula. And this is a great area of chalk that sticks out into the North Sea. And as you can see here, there are cliffs about 400 feet high with one of Britain's largest seabird colonies. Next. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people came here specifically just to shoot birds. They were referred to as roughies, hooligans, and they killed about 100,000 birds each year. Next. Not surprisingly, some people were deeply upset by this, not least Alfred Newton. He was the most eminent British ornithologist in the Victorian era, and he got to hear of this. And because he'd previously been very concerned about the extinction of the great auk, he was worried that all this shooting that was happening on these cliffs might result in the extinction of these murres on the left, or birds like the kittiwake underneath. And he launched the Seabird Protection Act of 1869. Next. Following that, you can feel this empathy for birds, this need to protect birds slowly beginning to gain momentum. So in the United States, there was Florence Merriam Bailey. She was very vocal about this. And in Britain, Edmund Selous confronted the museum people in particular and challenged them to lay down their guns and simply watch birds, and by doing so recognize that they might actually find that more enjoyable than killing birds. Next. But the person I think, or two people really, that I think captured this was Oscar Heinroth and his wife. And so this is Oscar. He was director of the aquarium at Berlin Zoo in Germany. And luckily for him, he was a birdman, really, he wasn't a fishman. Luckily for him, the aquarium also had a wildfowl collection. And at the bottom of the slide there, you can see a number of different wildfowl engaged in their social and sexual displays. Teal, European teal on the left, a ruddy duck, and a goldeneye. And he was the first person to think about using bird behavior as a comparative tool in terms of trying to understand their taxonomy and phylogeny. Next slide. He got married. This is a picture of the year before he got married, to Magdalena. Next. And she was unable to have children and channeled her efforts into hand-rearing birds. And she and Oscar came up with the idea that this was a way that they could understand the relative importance of nature versus nurture in terms of birds' behavior. So if you hand-reared a bird where it had no influence from its parents, then what you must be seeing must be largely nature. And over a 30-year period, Magdalena hand-reared over 1,000 individuals of 300 different species of birds, from the tiny goldcrest, which is Britain or Europe's smallest bird, to the bearded vulture, which is one of Europe's largest birds. And this was, just a phenomenal effort. And eventually her husband wrote it up. Sadly, she never lived to see the published account of all her efforts, because shortly after the project was completed, she took a holiday and died basically of exhaustion during that holiday. So it was rather tragic. But that project, I mean, you can't think of anyone being closer to birds than she was. And all those birds were reared in their apartment above the aquarium in the zoo. It's just absolutely phenomenal. Next slide. I'm going to now move to talk a little bit about my own empathy for birds and my study of murres, which has taken place on this island, which is Skomer Island off the coast of Wales. And I've been working there for 50 years now. Next. And as this slide and the next slide shows, I started off as a youthful, hairy ornithologist, and then several decades of watching murres turns you hairless. But my passion for murres, and here they are, the chicks that I've been banding, never diminishes really. So I've been involved in this study for all those years to try to understand how the murre population works on that island. And when I started, the population was in steep decline. In the 1930s, there were probably 100,000 murres on Skomer. By the time I started in the 1970s, it was down to 2,000. So a massive 95% decline. Amazingly, from about 1980, the population started to increase. And over the last 40 or 50 years, we've been trying to figure out how that population works in terms of whether the survival rate of the adult birds, the survival rate of the chicks, which we measure by looking for resightings of those banded birds, which you can see in some of these pictures, accounts for the population increase. And that, together with the breeding success of the birds, does account for the changes in the population. So we've kind of solved that problem, but it did take 30 years worth of data. Next. And so here, as top left is a group of guillemots. They're very unusual in breeding at very high density. There's the island, different view. Murres lay these wonderful, brightly colored, pointed eggs. egg collectors in the past would say that no two Murre eggs were the same. And so the eggs are unique, and the female lays the same color and pattern of egg every year. And that's because they breed at such high density, as you can see on the top left there, that this unique color and pattern allows each pair to recognize its own egg and only incubate its own egg. And then next to the egg is a chick. At about the time the chick is about to fledge, they leave the colony at about a quarter of the adult's weight. And this picture on the right here is just a beautiful common murre. People think they're not as exciting as puffins, which are a bit more twee and beautiful, but I'm extremely fond of murres. Next. But they've been subject to a wide range of threats. That initial decline was all due to oil pollution, which was very common between the 1930s and the 1960s. Next. But in recent years, climate change has had a marked effect. Warmer, wetter, windier, storms in the winter are stronger, and mortality of the birds is related to how severe the winter weather conditions are. Next. Climate change has had a devastating effect at some colonies on the amount of food that is available for the adult birds and the chicks. So here, this is the Isle of May, where a colleague of mine works. This is on the east coast of Scotland. And in 2007, everything seemed to be going as normal. The birds laid eggs, but when the chicks hatched, there was simply no fish to feed the chicks on, and all the chicks died. And so these are some of the ones that were just washed up as a result of that. Next, in the top of this picture now, this is Fair Isle. I used to work on Fair Isle in the 1980s when things were fine. And then in those years, 2004, 2008, 11 and 13, the birds simply did not breed at all because there was no food, no fish. And in the history of murre biology, not breeding is unheard of. So these two colonies tell us that something really disastrous is happening, and it's all caused by climate change. Next. And then, of course, this last year, we've been hit by avian flu. Two pictures on the left are part of a colony of gannets called the Bass Rock. And on the top picture there, you can see what the colony was like in 2020. And the bottom picture is what it was like last year after bird flu. It's taken out a huge proportion of the birds. Luckily for my murres on Scoma, bird flu didn't seem to affect them last year. And we're keeping our fingers crossed for this year. But a number of species like gannets, great skewers, and a few others have been very hard hit by bird flu. And this is obviously not climate change induced, but it is human induced. Next. And in fact, when I started the study, you know, if you mentioned climate change, a lot of people said, well, it doesn't exist. But I think the evidence now is so overwhelming that everybody is convinced that climate change is a major problem. Next. And the devastation that it has on nature is really depressing, because we depend on nature almost in a way to counteract the effect of climate change. And of course, that very nature that is such a consolation to us is what is being affected by climate change. And people often say to me, well, what of the future? What hope have we got? Next. And I think the future lies in the next generation, young people, all these people. Greta, you'll all know, the others are British. They're kind of environmental activists. And I think we do have to take extreme action to make politicians realize that this is not a simple problem. It's not a trivial problem. It's not one that's going to go away. It's only going to get worse. So we have to continue trying to save birds. And to do that, you need empathy for birds. Next. And finally, I just want to finish by saying a little bit about the Faroes. So people still hunt pilot whales there. People still take fulmar eggs and other birds' eggs. Yet in the capital, you can go into the supermarket and buy everything that I can buy in England. So people say, well, why are these people still hunting birds and hunting whales? And the answer that you get if you speak to the Faroese people is that their entire economy and the fact that there is a supermarket hinges on the fact that they farm salmon on a huge scale. I think I'm right in saying that the salmon farming on the Faroes is run by just 2 individuals. And if you look at what's happened with salmon farming in different parts of the world, the potential for things to go wrong and for the whole farming system to collapse is very strong indeed. The local people say that if they abandon their hunting techniques, their traditional ways of hunting seabirds and collecting eggs, and the bottom falls out of the salmon market, what are they going to have to eat? They would have to fall back on their traditional hunting methods. And I have some sympathy for that particular view. And then finally, next slide. Okay, and the next one, sorry. That's the end, and I'm very happy to try and answer your questions. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Birkhead, for your presentation. For everybody watching, now would be a great time to post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I see we have 2 questions right now. First question for you, how do you think the general public's increased interest in birding as well as technology help science, particularly in the time of climate change?
That's a very good question. I think one of the most striking aspects of that particular question is how much citizen science is involved in the conservation of birds. People now use, for example, things like eBird, and that provides huge amounts of data. And the Cornell Lab of Ornithology have illustrated this beautifully by being able to plot the movements of birds as they, for example, migrate from South America up through Central America and North America. And we can quantify those kind of patterns using citizen science data. So I think the technology that goes with measuring those effects and the huge public interest are incredibly important for science.
Awesome, thank you. Next question we have from Leslie Davis. She asks, does backyard feeding of birds have any effect on preservation of the species? And do you see any positives?
Okay, that's a very apposite question. And it's one that's often asked in Britain because a lot of people, as in North America, feed the birds. And I'm sure it's true with North American birds as well, like house finches. Some diseases seem to be passed from feeder to birds. And this is certainly true in Britain. And the British Trust for Ornithology have looked at this and tried to address it. And they don't really want people to stop feeding birds. Not only does the food play an important role in their lives and probably helps their survival, but it's also incredibly important for the people that watch their feeders and get enjoyment from seeing them. So on balance, they say, although there is a kind of health risk for certain species, on balance, you should not stop feeding. But what you could do or should do is to try to keep your feeders clean so that it minimizes the chances of disease transmission.
Thank you. Next question we have from Carlin Schenk. Let's see. Did the roughies take any of the birds they shot for food, or were the birds simply wasted?
Yeah, sadly, almost all of them were just wasted. I mean, the problem is that seabirds like murres and kittiwakes, they feel safe on their cliff ledges because no predator, no non-human predator can get at them. And so when people shot them, some birds would leave at the sound of the shot, but they'd come straight back. And so For the roughies, it was basically target practice. And just, I mean, it's not that different, to be honest, from a huge amount of pheasant shooting that takes place, certainly in Britain at the moment. In some cases, as the fashion for having bird feathers in hats and so on took off, some of the kittiwakes were sent to London to be transformed into hat ornaments.
Thank you. Next question we have from Maria Hinners. Have you looked into the count of murres? I wonder how the population has been affected over time, especially in modern times.
Well, that's a good question. So when I started my PhD in 1972, my supervisor told me about a man who was a kind of local hero in that part of Wales called Ronald Lockley. And he'd lived on some of the Welsh islands. And he'd visited Skomer in the 1930s. And fortunately for me, he photographed one of the main Guillemot cliff faces that holds about 30 or 40% of the entire population. Even more fortunately, he used a large format camera, which means that if I could get hold of the negatives and make some prints, I could probably just about count the individual birds. And that's exactly what I did. I wasn't able to interpret those pictures very easily until I'd been doing the study for about 30 years. But that allowed me to estimate that in 1933, when Lockley took those pictures, the total population on Skomer was about 100,000 pairs, a minimum of 100,000 pairs. And then subsequently, there were lots and lots of reports of birds being killed by fuel oil or oil dumped from tankers. And there were many, many reports of that. And I'm pretty sure that the 95% reduction, which took place between the beginning of the Second World War and 1960, was due to oiling. And people have been monitoring the incidence of oiling in birds. And since about 1980, luckily, oiling has reduced, but of course, it's kind of replaced by climate change and bird flu. So we have counted the birds. At the present time, there's about 25,000 pairs of guillemots or murres breeding on Skomer. So I'm kind of excited about that. It's kind of a dream come true for me. When I was doing my PhD, I fantasized about an increasing rather than a decreasing population. So it's been very exciting to see that increase. However, to get back to 100,000 pairs, it would take another 50 years. So whether we could do that without anything going wrong remains to be seen.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you. Next question we have from Mary Murrell. What do you think about the conservation funding model in the United States, which is dependent on taxes on hunting and fishing equipment? The one category of birds that isn't declining is waterfowl, largely due to the work of duck hunters. Is this all screwed up?
Okay, we don't have that model here, so I'm not in a very strong position to comment on that, but it is rather telling that duck populations are not in decline because they're protected by hunters. And you could say the same thing about deer. I think that's true in Europe as well. Yeah, I mean, it causes a bit of a moral conflict, doesn't it? You allow hunting in order to protect species. I'm not sure that would work for other categories of birds, but it's an interesting and it's a complex question, and I have to admit that it's one that I hadn't really thought about before, but it definitely is one that I need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Chris Perrell. We are experiencing an outbreak of avian flu that is seriously affecting the chicken farming industry, especially in egg production. Are avian flu strains specific or species specific, or do they affect all birds in general?
Okay, another excellent question. They don't, bird flu doesn't seem to affect all birds indiscriminately. In Britain, amongst seabirds, it's been gannets and great skewers, whereas other species seem to have escaped. Swans have been badly affected, cranes have been badly affected. But you know, if bird flu affected all of them equally, we would see a lot of dead birds of different species, and obviously small birds do not seem to be affected. I think that's the best answer I can give to that.
Thank you. Susan Crowley asks, this is a confirmation. Did you say that cats kill 100 million birds globally per day?
That's the estimate that has been published. I mean, it's hard to take in, isn't it? But there are a lot of cats out there and there are a lot of birds out there. But if it's true, it's shocking.
That is incredible. All right, next question from Diane Buck. What was bird guano used for early on, and what is it used for now?
Okay, thanks. I should have said that. Okay, it was basically, that's fertilizer. It's nitrogen. It's a very, very effective fertilizer. And when people first visited those islands off the coast of Peru, where there were vast populations of boobies and other seabirds, the guano, which had been dried in the sun, was like 15 meters thick on these islands. So they were literally mining guano. But after several decades of doing that, the guano, they're down to the bare rock now. There is still some guano harvesting off the islands of Peru, Ballester Islands, which I visited a couple of years ago before COVID, and that's still used for fertilizer. But it's easier now to make artificial fertilizer, so you don't really need to be chipping away at the guano on these islands.
Thank you. Next question from Natalie Beacom. We've purchased your book from our library in Wisconsin, and it is circulating very well. Can you tell us what books you are currently reading and would recommend? Thank you.
Okay, that's an interesting question. The one I just bought that arrived with Amazon today is by Anne Cleves. It's a novel. I don't read many novels, but this one is based on a bird observatory on a little island that I also used to work on called Fair Isle, which lies between the tip of Scotland and Shetland. And Anne Cleves is the author of a large number of best-selling novels, and her books have been turned into TV programs. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Somebody told me about this just a couple of days ago, so I ordered the book. I've also just finished reading a very different kind of book by the Dutch ornithologist Temminck, who was one of the first people to really think about bird taxonomy and so on. That was a much harder read, a bit more of a technical book. And I've also been doing a lot of reading about the great auk, which is going to be the subject of my next book.
All right, thank you. I'm writing these down too. So thank you for that question. Jane Potter, her question is, when a bird from a warmer part of the world arrives somewhere cold, like Maine, where I live, should it be returned to its native area or left to fend for itself? A few years ago, a South American bird in Maine ended up with frozen legs and didn't survive. Are these individual birds seeking new terrain due to climate change?
Okay, that's a fascinating question. When a lot of birds, as you know, migrate, but the genetic program that determines which direction they go in isn't faultless. And although in North America and in Britain, birds migrate south in the winter to go to warmer climates, there's a small proportion of birds that will fly north or east or west. And normally, those birds that don't go in the right direction will simply die. That is basically natural selection in action. But in Europe, something curious has happened in the last 40 or 50 years as climate changes has made our winters much milder. So blackcaps, a little warbler, typically migrated from Central Europe to Africa to spend the winter. But as I just said, a small proportion flew north and some flew east and west. And some of those birds that flew in the wrong direction turned up in Britain. And because previously, with the hard winter, all of those birds would have died. So the genes for doing that would just disappear. But because we've had these mild winters as a result of climate change, a lot of those birds have survived over winter And we see them typically in our gardens. We used to think of them as summer visitors, but some of them are here all winter. And those birds have a huge advantage because they haven't paid the energetic cost of flying all the way to Africa and back. And so they get back to their breeding territories much sooner than the traditional migrants. So the birds that we get in England in the winter are German blackcaps. And so they get back to Germany much sooner. But generally speaking, to answer your question, birds that go in the wrong direction probably don't survive. And whether we should do something about it is a bit debatable, really, because you could end up looking after a lot of birds that go in the wrong direction.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I have a question kind of based off of that one. There was recently a mandarin duck found in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, here in North America. And I was wondering what you think or why you think that could be, because usually these mandarin ducks obviously are not native here, but I know that they are somewhat related to the wood duck here in North America. Some people believe, I've heard it could be an escapee from a zoo or something like that. What do you think?
My guess is that it's probably an escapee, because that's exactly what has happened in Britain. And in 1972, when I started my career, if somebody said they'd seen a mandarin duck, everybody would be very excited and wonder whether they'd flown from China. But of course they hadn't. They'd escaped from wildfowl collections. And now mandarin ducks are probably the commonest duck in this part of Britain where I live. I mean, they're very beautiful, they're very striking, but they shouldn't really be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Next question from Maria Henners. What measures has your government taken to reduce human damage of nesting spaces, especially along the cliffs?
Okay, so most seabird colonies in Britain now are protected. So there's no hunting, no egg collecting, and most of those places are bird reserves. So I think the level of protection for seabirds is actually very good at the moment. And that's true for a number of other species as well, because we're well endowed with lots of reserves.
Thank you. Next question from Rita Kale. What is the name of the Anne Cleeves book that you suggested? The one I think from the previous question.
Yeah, I think it's called Blue Horizon.
Blue Horizon. Okay. Thank you.
I don't have it in front of me, I'm afraid, at the moment.
All right. Next question.
If you go onto Amazon and just type in her name, Anne Cleeves, it's a whole series of books relating to Shetland, and it's I think it's the fourth one in the series.
All right. Thank you.
Blue Lightning. Thank you.
Yes, in the comments, Blue Lightning.
Thank you.
All right.
You know what it's like. Your Amazon package arrives, you go, right, I'll read that later, and you don't really look too hard.
Perfect. All right. Thank you again. Next question from Diane Hoffner Safier. What are one or two of the best efforts a normal family can make/take to promote environmental stewardship and healthy bird life?
Well, that's a very good question. The reason I've written a succession of, in quotes, popular science books is really to increase awareness of birds, and also to kind of make people realize that birds are absolutely remarkable. One of my books a few years ago was called Bird Sense, which looked at how birds perceive the world. And there's just a lot more going on in birds' brains and minds than people ever thought. And my goal was just to make people think, wow, birds are amazing. And if you think they're amazing, then they're worth protecting. So I think simply by promoting the fact that birds are amazing, you can actually do a lot. And if you visit bird reserves and go and sit in bird hides and stuff, as I indicated earlier in the talk, lots of people want to chat. And okay, to some extent, you're preaching to the converted, but it is a very good way to enthuse about birds and get people to pass on the message. And ultimately, that will bring pressure to bear on governments in terms of protecting birds.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have a few questions in the chat that may have been left out. Question from Tamara Lubick. Any positive conservation news recently? I'm assuming bird related.
I'm struggling to think of any positive conservation news. I mean, there have been a number of species that have turned up, certainly in Britain, possibly as a consequence of climate change that wouldn't have been here previously. And that's kind of good news in one sense, and that it allows people to see birds that they wouldn't otherwise have seen. But of course, the ultimate reason for that is climate change, which is not good news. So it is hard to think of anything really positive. But there's been some successful reintroductions. I'm a reproductive biologist, hence the Freudian slip. So in Britain, one of the most successful reintroductions was the red kite. And that has been fantastically successful. Whereas the red kite was originally confined to a tiny area of Wales, now you can see them pretty well everywhere in Britain, and people love to see them. They're spectacular flyers.
Thank you. I have another question for you, actually, from me. So you had shown in your presentation and that you had studied photographs and images and artworks from caves to learn about these birds and learn how to identify birds, especially in like the beginning times when people had to create those physical collections to learn how to identify a bird and what they are. So as an artist and amateur bird watcher myself, I just kind of want to know, do you keep a field guide with sketches or do you take photographs? I guess, how do you observe birds when you're out in the field?
Okay, good question. So in the past, I did a lot of sketching. Now it's easier just to use a camera. And so when I'm birding, I usually carry the camera with me. And of course, as all birders know, you can take a picture through a telephoto lens, magnify it up, and that gives you a better view than even you would get probably with a telescope. So it's quite an important aid. But I have at home a large format field guide, beautifully illustrated. It's the Collins Field Guide to European Birds. And I often refer to that as well, partly because it's got a lot of interesting text and distribution maps.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Are there any other questions from anybody else participating in the webinar today? All right. It seems like that is it. So
Good.
Thank you all for coming and joining us. Thank you again to Dr. Birkhead for having us as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Birkhead. I just want to remind folks, we have another event with Schlitz Audubon on February 10th for the Wise Hours, a journey into the wild and secret world of owls. And we still have, this has been a huge hit for us, sir, over the holidays. Such a beautiful book, if you haven't bought it yet, at wherever you like to buy books. Yes, another beautiful copy. We're so thrilled that you were able to do this with us. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for some very thought-provoking questions. It's always very stimulating. For me, the questions are always the best bit. It's great. Thank you.